The letter from Weston Hale described a well-maintained cattle operation outside Laramie, Wyoming territory. It mentioned a solid house, steady income, and a man who valued hard work and good sense above all else. It did not mention that the solid house had a roof that leaked in 3 places, that the steady income had not been steady since the drought of 1889, and that the man's idea of good sense was to handle everything alone, and ask nobody for anything ever. The letter from Dorothea Crane described a capable woman with experience managing a household, cooking for a family, and keeping accounts. It mentioned composure under pressure and a practical nature. It did not mention that Dorothea had managed exactly one household, her late father's boarding house in Cincinnati, and that the boarding house had 11 rooms, a paid cook, and a handyman named Gerald, who fixed everything before she noticed it was broken. They were both telling a version of the truth, the version where you leave out the parts that would make someone say no. I've heard a lot of stories about people who came to the frontier expecting one thing and got another. Most of those stories end badly. This one didn't, but it came close. Weston Hale was 41 years old and had been ranching outside Laramie for 14 years. He was not a tall man, but he was a solid one. The kind of solid that comes from doing the same hard physical work every day for a decade and a half, not from any particular gift of nature. He had a face that had stopped being young sometime around 1884 and hadn't changed much since. He said what he needed to say and nothing more. His neighbors found him reliable. His cattle found him consistent. He had not in 14 years found anyone who found him easy. He had written to the matrimonial agency in April because his knee had been giving him trouble since February, because the winter had taken 2 of his best breeding cows, and because he had burned his own supper 4 nights in a row and stood at the stove on the 5th night looking at a pan of scorched beans and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, I cannot keep doing this alone. He was not romantic about it. He needed a partner, someone who could run the domestic side of the operation so he could focus on the cattle. Someone practical. Someone who wouldn't flinch at mud or cold or the smell of a working ranch. He wrote all of this in the letter, or at least a polished version of it. He did not mention the knee. He did not mention the roof. He described the operation as it had been in 1886, when the grass was good and the herd was healthy, and he told himself this was not dishonesty. It was optimism, and that optimism was what you needed to survive in Wyoming. Dorothea Crane was 36 and had been running on fumes since her father died 18 months before. Cornelius Crane had owned a boarding house on Sycamore Street in Cincinnati for 22 years. It was not a grand establishment, but it was respected. Clean rooms, fair prices, a cook named Mrs. Abbott who produced meals so reliably good that 3 of the long-term boarders had stayed for the food alone. Dorothea had grown up in that house. She had watched her father manage it, had helped with the books since she was 14, had known every crack in every wall and every peculiarity of every guest. What she had not done was actually cook the food, fix the cracks, or negotiate with the suppliers. That was Mrs. Abbott and Gerald and her father in that order. When Cornelius died, he left the boarding house to Dorothea and a modest sum of money that was enough to run the place for perhaps 8 months if nothing went wrong. Something went wrong. The boiler failed in October. Gerald retired to live with his daughter in Columbus. Mrs. Abbott, who was 63 and had been threatening to retire for a decade, finally did it. Dorothea hired replacements for all 3 of them, and the replacements were not Mrs. Abbott and Gerald, and by January she had burned through most of the money and was looking at a ledger that told her what she already suspected. She could not make this work alone. She sold the boarding house in March. She wrote to the matrimonial agency in April because she was practical, not because she was hopeful. She needed a situation that used what she actually had: organizational ability, a head for numbers, the capacity to manage a complicated household, and the agency had listings for men in the territories who needed exactly that. She picked Weston Hale's letter because he said he valued hard work and good sense. She appreciated that he hadn't said anything about beauty. She described herself accurately, in the same way that he had described himself accurately, by selecting the true things that made her sound like what he needed, and leaving out the rest. She arrived in Laramie on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Weston was at the depot. He had shaved that morning, which he did not do every morning, and he was wearing a clean shirt, which he did not own many of. He stood near the platform and watched the passengers come off the train and thought, she'll be easy to spot. Women traveling alone usually are. He spotted her immediately. Dorothea Crane stepped off the train carrying a traveling bag, a leather satchel with a brass clasp, and an expression of focused assessment. Not horror, not delight. Just the look of a woman taking inventory of a situation she had not yet decided about. She was looking at the town, at the wide dirt street and the wooden storefronts and the sky, which was the particular flat gray of a Wyoming autumn and seemed to go on without apology in every direction. Weston walked over. He said, "Mr. Hale." Not a question, a confirmation. He reached for the traveling bag. She let him take it. She kept the leather satchel. On the ride out to the ranch, she asked 3 questions. How many acres? How many head of cattle? How far to the nearest town? He answered all three. He did not offer anything else. She did not press. They rode the last 2 miles in silence, which he found comfortable and she found informative. Then she saw the house. It was not small exactly. It had 2 stories and a covered porch, and it sat on a slight rise above the pasture, so you could see the mountains to the west on clear days. What it looked like, if you were being honest, was a house that had been built with ambition, and maintained with the minimum amount of attention required to prevent structural failure. There were boards on the porch that had gone soft. The paint on the window frames had peeled so thoroughly, in places that the raw wood beneath had started to gray, and along the north side of the roofline, Dorothea could see where shingles had shifted and not been replaced, and where someone had attempted to solve this problem with what appeared to be tar paper and hope. She looked at all of this for a long moment. She said, "Your letter said solid house." He said, "It's solid where it counts." She said, "Where does it count?" He said, "The foundation, the walls, the stove." She looked at the roof. He said, "The roof is on the list." She said, "How long has it been on the list?" He said, 2 years. She looked at him. He looked at the mountains. They went inside. The kitchen was larger than she expected, which was the only thing that was larger than she expected. The stove was a good one. Heavy cast iron, barely rusted, the kind of stove that would hold heat through a Wyoming winter if you fed it right. The pantry had been stocked recently. She could tell with the self-conscious thoroughness of a man trying to demonstrate preparedness. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt, pork, a tin of lard, coffee. Everything you needed and nothing you didn't. She put her satchel on the kitchen table and opened it. She had brought a ledger, a set of accounts from the boarding house, and 3 books. A household management guide, a volume on cattle husbandry she had purchased in Cincinnati specifically because she was coming to a cattle ranch and intended to understand it, and a worn copy of Middlemarch that she had no intention of explaining to anyone. Weston looked at the ledger. He said, "What's that for?" She said, "Keeping accounts." "I'll need to see yours," he said. "My accounts are in my head," she said. "That's where accounts go wrong." He didn't answer. He showed her to the room upstairs, a spare bedroom, small with a window that looked west and a quilt that was old but clean. He said supper was her department and left. Dorothea stood in the room for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went downstairs to the kitchen and opened every cabinet. She could cook, in the sense that she had watched Mrs. Abbott cook for 22 years and had retained most of what she saw. What she had not done, until this moment, was cook on a wood stove in a kitchen she didn't know, using ingredients she had not selected. For a man who had said 5 sentences to her since she arrived, the biscuits came out flat. Not inedible but flat. Dense in the middle, pale on top. The kind of biscuit that communicates effort without delivering results. The beans were acceptable. The coffee was good. She had paid close attention to the coffee, having learned from the boarding house that men will tolerate a great deal if the coffee is right. Weston ate everything. He didn't say anything about the biscuits. He poured a second cup of coffee and said, "Good coffee." She said, "Thank you." He said, "The biscuits need more heat at the start." She said, "I know." He said, "You've used a wood stove before?" There was a pause that was approximately 3 seconds longer than it should have been. She said, "I'm learning the particular characteristics of this one." He looked at her. She looked at the coffee. He got up and washed his own plate, which she had not expected, and went to bed. What Weston did not know yet was that Dorothea had spent the entire wagon ride from Laramie, calculating how much of the house she had already seen needed fixing, and that the number was higher than she'd prepared herself for, and that what she'd felt looking at that porch and that roof line was not dismay, so much as the specific cold clarity that comes when you realize a problem is larger than you thought, and you are going to have to be larger than you thought too. She had made a decision before she got off the train. She was not going back to Cincinnati. There was nothing in Cincinnati to go back to. She had sold the house on Sycamore Street and she had spent 11 years of her adult life managing a place that she'd told herself she was good at, and that had, when it came to it, survived on the work of 3 other people who were now retired or dead. She was 36 years old, she was starting over, and she was going to do it right this time. That meant learning the stove. It meant learning the cattle. It meant learning Wyoming. She did not intend to be useless in this house for 1 day longer than she had to be. She asked him to teach her things, and this was not a request he knew what to do with. In 14 years of ranching, Weston Hale had taught no one anything. He had learned everything himself, from books and from failure, and from watching other men make mistakes. And he had assumed that this was how knowledge moved. From the world to the person, without any instruction in between. He was not a patient man. He was also not a man who used words unless they were necessary, and he'd spent the last several years in the company of cattle, who required no words at all. Dorothea asked him to show her how to manage the stove. He showed her. She watched with the complete, noting attention of someone who intends to only need to be told something once. And then she did it herself, and she was not perfectly right on the first try. But she was so close that he was briefly disconcerted. She said, "What did I do wrong?" He said, "Loaded it too fast. You want to build the heat, not fight the wood." She said, "Show me again." He showed her again. She asked him about the cattle. Not the management of them, which she said she would get to, but the basics. What they needed, what it looked like when they were sick, how to read the pasture condition. He told her briefly, expecting her attention to drop. It didn't. She was taking notes. He stopped and looked at the notepad and felt the odd sensation of watching someone take his 14 years of accumulated hard knowledge and put it into a form that could be passed on. He said, "You're writing it down?" She said. "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I want to remember it correctly, and my memory is good but not infallible. Also because someday when you're not here I'll need to know this without asking." He didn't say anything for a moment. He said, "What do you mean when I'm not here?" She said, "If you're in town or ill or if something happens. Ranches don't wait." He had been doing this for 14 years. Nobody had ever said that to him before, and it struck him somewhere in the chest, between the ribs, in a place he couldn't entirely name. The simple fact that she was planning for continuity, not just her own convenience, the ranch. She went back to her notepad. He went back to the pasture. He spent the walk thinking about something he hadn't thought about in a very long time, which was what it would mean for this place to have a future. The first month was the hardest. Not because they argued. They were both too self-contained for argument, too accustomed to solving problems without involving other people. What made it hard was the negotiation that happened without either of them naming it. Whose territory was what? Who made which decisions? How two people who had each spent years running things alone were going to share a house and a ranch and a future that neither of them had entirely signed up for. Dorothea took over the accounts. This was not negotiated. She simply asked to see what he had. Spent an evening with his ledger. A battered thing with half the entries in pencil. And the next morning put a cleaner version in front of him at breakfast with 3 questions about expenditures he hadn't bothered to track. He answered the questions. She noted the answers. She didn't comment on the state of the books, and he didn't comment on the fact that she had apparently redone his entire financial record overnight, and that was how they handled it. She also started fixing things, not the big things. The roof, the porch boards, the window frames, but the accumulation of small things that a man living alone eventually stops seeing. She rehung the pantry door so it shut properly. She found where cold air was coming in under the kitchen door frame and packed it with rags until she could get weather stripping from town. She oiled the hinges on every door in the house, because they squeaked, and squeaking hinges were, she said, purely optional suffering. Weston noticed all of it. He did not say anything, but he began to notice, in the specific way of a man who has spent a long time not being noticed, that the house felt different, tighter, more intentional, like someone had decided it mattered. She learned to make biscuits that were actually good by the 3rd week. She was methodical about it in a way that he found privately impressive. She made biscuits every other morning, made notes about what she'd changed, and by the 22nd day produced a pan of biscuits so uniformly risen and properly browned that he paused when he bit into one and looked at it. She was watching him. She said, "Better?" He said yes. She said, "I think the trick is the temperature you told me at the start. And the lard ratio." He said, "Where'd you learn about lard ratios?" She patted the household management book without looking up from her coffee. He said, "You brought books about cooking." She said, "I brought books about everything I was going to need to know." The bookshelf was his fault, in the way that most good things between them turned out to be. Not planned, not romantic, just a practical response to an obvious problem. She had her 3 books stacked on the kitchen table, which worked until she got more books, which happened faster than he expected, because she wrote to a bookseller in Denver in her 2nd week and by November had received 2 parcels containing 7 additional volumes, another household manual, a book on range cattle management, a field guide to Wyoming grasses, a medical reference, a volume of American poetry, and 2 novels, one she'd read before and wanted to reread, one she hadn't. She shelved all of them against the kitchen wall using a plank and 2 stacked crates, which was functional but precarious. He built her a proper shelf. He was, he knew, not much of a carpenter. The measurements came out slightly off on the 2nd shelf, and he spent 40 minutes correcting this before deciding it was level enough to matter and leaving it. He put it up on the living room wall, which had more space, and didn't say anything about it. Just moved the books from the kitchen while she was outside and arranged them in roughly the order he'd seen her arrange the crates. She came inside and stopped. She looked at the shelf. She looked at him. He was sitting in his chair with his boots off and a cup of coffee like he'd been there all afternoon. She said, "When did you do this?" He said, "While you were checking the south fence." She said, "You moved all the books in order," he said. "I watched how you had them." She walked over to the shelf and ran her finger along the spines. She straightened one book that he'd put in slightly crooked. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Weston." It was the first time she'd used his first name without it being in response to a direct question. He said, "The 2nd shelf's not perfectly level." She said, "It's close enough." That evening she read to him from the poetry volume, Not asking, just beginning the way she'd apparently decided she was going to do it, matter of fact and without ceremony. He was doing the accounts she'd left for him to check, and he didn't say anything, and she read for about 20 minutes. When she stopped, he sat for a moment longer than necessary before going back to the numbers. He said, without looking up, "Read another one." She did. "I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part of the story that people always ask about. The when of it, the exact moment a practical arrangement becomes something else. The truth is there isn't a single moment. There's a sequence of small ones, the bookshelf, the first name, the poetry, the fact that he started checking the accounts without being asked, and that she started leaving coffee ready for him in the mornings before he was up. Small accountings. But there was one night, and if I had to choose a moment to point to, I would point to February, and a horse, and a choice she made without thinking about it, because thinking wasn't what the moment called for. February 4, 1891. A wind had been coming down from the north, all afternoon. The kind that comes flat across the high prairie, and doesn't break against anything because there's nothing to break against. By 9 o'clock the temperature had dropped past the point where Dorothea could see her breath inside the kitchen, despite the stove being fully loaded. And Weston had gone out twice to check the barn and come back without saying anything, which meant it was worse than he wanted to tell her. At 11 o'clock he put his coat on again. He said, "One of the mares is showing signs of colic. I'm going to walk her." Colic in a horse in February cold was a death sentence if you let it progress. She knew this because she had read the veterinary reference 3 times since November, and colic had its own chapter. He said, "You don't need to come." She was already getting her coat. He said, "Dorothea." She said, "You need someone to spell you on the walking. You can't walk her alone all night." He said, "I've done it before." She said, "And how many times did it work?" He stopped. She said, "I'm not asking you to be grateful. I'm telling you that 2 people walking a horse through in the cold is better than 1, and that I'm the second person's person, and we should go." They went. The mare's name was Calliope, which Weston had named her when she was a foal, and which he now found slightly embarrassing to say out loud in company, so he generally didn't. Dorothea had figured out the name from the registration he kept in the ledger. She didn't mention this. They walked Calliope in the barn for 4 hours. Back and forth along the center aisle, the mares breathing ragged at first and then slowly evening out. They didn't talk much. There was nothing to talk about that mattered more than the horse and the cold and keeping her moving. Dorothea walked the first hour, Weston took the second. She took the third, and somewhere in the 4th hour she was walking and he was watching, and he said quietly, "She's coming around." Dorothea looked at the mare's sides. The breathing was steady now. Her ears had come back up. She had started paying attention to things outside herself, which is how you know a horse has decided to live. Dorothea stopped walking. She put her hand on Calliope's neck, under the mane where it was warm, and felt the pulse slow and regular. Weston came and stood next to her. He put his hand next to hers and they stood like that, both of them with hands on the horse's neck in the dark barn, at 3 in the morning, with the wind still coming off the mountain, and he said, "You didn't have to stay." She said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Why?" She thought about it for a moment, not the answer which she knew but whether she was going to say it. She said, "Because she's yours, and what's yours is partly mine now, whether we've said it in those words or not, and I don't leave what's mine." He didn't say anything. She went back inside to rebuild the kitchen fire. He stayed with Calliope until sunrise, and when he came in she had coffee and eggs ready and didn't make anything of it. And he sat down and ate and then said, "Your letter said, experience managing a household." She said, "I have experience managing a household." He said, "You left out the part about the cook and the handyman." She looked at him. He said, "You figured it out anyway." She said, "Your letter said solid house." He said, "You fixed most of what wasn't solid." She said, "Still working on the roof." He said, "I'll get to the roof." She said, "I know you will." He said, "I'm going to fix the porch boards next week." She said, "I know." He said, "The second shelf on that bookcase is still not level." She said, "I measured it. It's off by less than a quarter inch. I'm not taking it apart." He looked at her. Something in his face that had been held at a careful distance for 5 months shifted. Not dramatically. Weston Hale did not do things dramatically. But it shifted, in the way that the light shifts in the last hour before morning without your being able to say exactly when it changed. He said, "I'm glad you came," she said. "I am too." They were married in April 1891 by a circuit preacher who came through Laramie on his twice-yearly route. It was a small ceremony. Weston wore the clean shirt. Dorothea wore a dress she had sewn herself over the winter, gray wool with white collar, practical and neat. She carried a cutting from the wild sage that had come up near the east pasture, because it was what was blooming, and she said she had never understood flowers that had to be bought. Over the next 25 years they rebuilt the house, piece by piece. The roof first, then the porch, then a proper kitchen addition, with a second stove and a larder that could hold a winter's worth of provisions. They expanded the herd from 40 head to 200. They raised cattle and wheat and 2 children, a boy and a girl, both of whom learned to read before they started school, and both of whom could rope a calf and mend a fence by the time they were 12. Dorothea kept the accounts for every one of those 25 years. She had a system. 3 ledgers color-coded, one for ranch expenses, one for household, one for long-term capital, that she had refined over the years, and that was so clear and so thorough, that when their son took over the operation, he said the records were the most valuable things she left him. Weston read every book on the shelf. This took him longer than it took Dorothea, and he did not read them in the order she would have chosen, and twice he started a novel and abandoned it in favor of a veterinary manual or a range management text, because he was who he was. He read all 7 of the novels eventually. He read the poetry volume twice, which he never told anyone, and which Dorothea figured out because she noticed the spine. He fixed the second shelf so it was perfectly level. He did this in year 3, without saying anything about it, and she noticed and didn't say anything either. The bookshelf grew until it filled the whole east wall of the living room. Dorothea organized it by subject, which Weston periodically disarranged and then reorganized his own way, which was by how much he liked the book, and she let him because it was a reasonable system and also because the disarranging was the only argument they had that never cost them anything. Dorothea became, over the years, a cook of considerable local reputation. She resisted this characterization. She said the standard in Wyoming was simply lower than what she'd grown up with in Cincinnati, and that she had the advantage of learning to cook without bad habits. Her neighbors disagreed. Her daughter disagreed loudest. At the last church social Dorothea attended, she was asked to bring her biscuits specifically by name. She brought them. Weston Hale died in 1919 at the age of 69 in the bedroom overlooking the west pasture and the mountains. Dorothea lived until 1931. She kept the accounts until the year before she died, when her eyesight made it impractical, and she handed them to her daughter with a 3-page summary of the system and a note that said, "Keep 3 ledgers, always reconcile at the end of the month, and do not let anyone tell you the numbers are not your department." She read from the poetry volume every evening until the end. She had worn the cover off and had it rebound once, with a piece of good leather from the saddle shop in Laramie, and she'd written the title on the spine in her own careful hand. She came expecting a practical arrangement. He came expecting someone who could run the house while he ran the cattle. They were both right, and both wrong, and what they built instead. From flat biscuits and a crooked bookshelf, and 4 hours walking a horse through a February night, was steadier and more lasting than anything either of them had put into a letter. I've been thinking about that second shelf. The one that wasn't level. The one he fixed without saying anything, 3 years after he built it, because it bothered him and because getting it right mattered. That's a kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up, quietly, and doing the work. Tell me, who do you think changed more? The woman who arrived with ledgers and books, and had never lit a wood stove, or the man who had spent 14 years doing everything alone, and finally learned to let someone stand beside him? Leave your answer below. And if you want another story about 2 people who found something better than what they came looking for, it's right here waiting for you.